Can't fear your own world. Part 1 Full translation. Do not seek aesthetics in waging war. Do not seek virtue in death. Do not think your life is your own. If you wish to protect the king and 5 heads, then you must slaughter every foe from under the shadow of the leaves. Excerpt from the old edition of the Shino Academy's textbook, Shinigami Regulations Encyclopedia. Do not seek aesthetics in waging war. Do not seek virtue in death. Do not think your life is your own. If you wish to protect the things that are worth protecting, then cut down the enemy you ought to defeat from behind. Excerpt from the latest edition of the Shino Academy's textbook, Shinigami Regulations Encyclopedia. Prologue 1 There was once a battle. A great war between those who called themselves gods who governed death and those who extinguished evil spirits. The conflict ceased in the form of losing their respective kings by the end of this feud which spanned 1,000 years. The relationship between Shinigami and Quincy will come to hail a new era triggered by this great loss. It is said that it was the very same person who killed both kings. He was neither Shinigami nor Quincy, but only a small fraction of people are aware of that fact. The ringleader of the Wandenreich, a rebel army which invaded Soul Society, was defeated by a young substitute Shinigami who is a guest of the Gote 13, along with the proclamation that the Gote 13 successfully defended the Soul King Palace. It is only this part of the story that continues to be propagated within Soul Society. In other words, it was decided that the very death of the Soul King, who is the foundation of Soul Society, is something that would be permanently concealed with the aim to suppress confusion and disorder. Even now, many inhabitants of the Soul Society, including ordinary foot soldiers, still believe they have their Soul King enshrined at the Soul King Palace. Knowledge of the facts are limited to only a handful of Shinigami such as captain ranks and senior officers, or those attached to important posts in the Seraiti. Even they dare not expose the truth and disturb the people's peace of mind. From there, the revival of the Seraiti that was left utterly devastated, would begin. As for whether or not the decision of the higher-ups, who did not deem it acceptable to snatch away the people's moral support, was right in the end, that is something that will likely be judged by history 10 or 100 years down the line. Ushering in the conclusion in such a way, the series of conflicts would subsequently be known as the Protection of the Soul King Great War. Time goes back to the point immediately after the war had ended. Soul King Palace Main Shrine, Greater Soul King Palace. At the spot where the former Soul King was enshrined, the palace Shinpei holy soldiers were hurriedly bustling about. The monk who calls the real name, Ikebe Hyasube, who is a member of the Zero Division, stroked his deep black beard whilst silently staring at the thing that is at the center of the room. From behind, an easygoing tone of voice calls out to him. Oh my, so that is the new Soul King Sama. High Priest. When the monk turned to look over his shoulder, standing there was a man donning an eye patch over his right eye, Kyoraku Shunsui. Dear me, you're up and about already. Yes, as Captain Commander of the Gote 13, it's a matter you have no choice in. The monk gives his reply in combination with a cheerful smile. Whilst confirming that Kyoraku's lines of sight was not on himself, but rather directed towards the center of the room where the Shinpei were working, he answered his companion's query. Given that it's you, I'm sure you know the answer already. The Soul King Sama is neither new nor old. There is significance in the mere fact that what we reverently refer to as the Soul King Sama can continue to exist here. Is that what you'd call all power being contained in names? With a complex expression still on his face, Kyoraku switches to honorific language and continues speaking. That is why in the worst-case scenario, it would have been Ichigo-kun being sealed inside that name. Isn't it a relief that it didn't come to that? The monk quite casually announces that, depending on the situation, there was also a possibility that Ichigo would become an entity called the Soul King. However, there is not a shred of anything akin to emotion dwelling amongst those words. Then, with a grin that bared his teeth, he spoke of Kurosaki Ichigo. I'm also fond of that boy. To reach a point where we would be unable to talk to him would be rather sad, wouldn't it? I'm glad it didn't turn out like that. This way I was also spared the resentment of Ichigo-kun's friends. Ah, you gave them those soul tickets, didn't you? I assume that you're going to keep it a secret from the Central 46 and that noble lot. Oh bother, just how far did you see through my game? High Priest. The status of Soul King. That is by no means a pleasant thing. On the contrary, Kyoraku had considered it one of the worst possible outcomes for Kurosaki Ichigo. Looking at the thing before his eyes, Kyoraku engraves it into his mind once again. Preparing for the worst, Kyoraku handed out special spiritual tools known as soul tickets to individuals who were close to Kurosaki Ichigo in the human world. This is a ticket that makes it possible to freely travel back and forth between the human world and the Soul Society. Improvements have been made based on the technology that was previously used to transport the humans of Karakura Town to Soul Society in their living state, resulting in this practical substitute. Kyoraku quietly cast down his eyes. Scenes of the time he went to inform Kurosaki Ichigo's friends of that one possibility played out in his mind. Depending on the nature of his powers, it could mean that it will become impossible for him to return to the world of the living. Reacting to his statement that he hadn't come to joke around, the young boy, despite acting the most foolish, declared with eyes filled with deep anger that, "You're not joking, yet somehow you expect us to say goodbye so easily." In contrast to he who had displayed his anger for Ichigo's sake with every fiber of his being, the black-haired youth stubbornly continued to believe in Ichigo with eyes that remained calm, and then there was the girl who was more concerned about Ichigo's family members rather than herself whilst harboring deep anguish and fear for Ichigo's well-being. Both Sato-kun and Orihime-chan too, Ichigo-kun is truly blessed with friends. Rather, I wonder if it's precisely because it's Ichigo-kun that those kids are drawn to him. Considering the youngsters of the human world, Kyoraku felt a sense of relief for Kurosaki Ichigo's safety, a key player who ended this war. Lifting his eyes a fraction, Kyoraku addressed the monk. Above all, I'm glad that Ichigo is not the one being cut down by the high priest and co. With little hesitation, Kyoraku gives utterance to curious words. Without denying nor affirming it, the high priest clapped his bald head as he gave a light-hearted laugh. I'm not Yuach after all. I can't foresee the future and such. Well, by all rights, Kurosaki Ichigo could not have won against that man, rather, he ought to have been defeated. High priest, however, fortunately for the boy, Yuach had completely obtained the power of the Soul King for himself. It is for this reason, even regardless of the fact that Kurosaki Ichigo had won, that the Soul Society was able to escape collapse in such a way. As he spoke, the monk turned towards the thing placed at the center of the greater palace and brought his hands together with a clap. Behind the monk, who closed his eyes in sync with the clear sound of his hands clapping together in prayer, Kyoraku attempted to question him further. High priest, is that the will of the Soul King? Or, is it the dying wish of the founders of the 5 great noble clans? In a slip of the tongue, the honorific language disappears from Kyoraku's speech. The monk then replies in a carefree manner. Come now, you're not going to pay your respects to our esteemed founders. You can't completely hide your hostility, I'll have you know. Do you also perceive Kuchiki Byakuya and Shihoin Yoruichi in such a way? I have no reason to think of them like that. They are comrades of the Gote 13, my precious friends. Shaking his head as he smiled wryly, Kyoraku resumed speaking with his manner of speech still thrown off balance. The actions of their ancestors have nothing to do with them, though on the other hand, it's not like they can eradicate their ancestors' sins. Am I right, High Priest? That may be true, but when all is said and done, the founders of the 5 great noble clans no longer exist. Just as the monk had gotten to that point, the sound of a dull explosion rang out across the greater palace. When Kyoraku turned to look in the direction of the noise, he could sense pronounced reiatsu different from that of a shinigamis coming from there. Ahead of their sightlines, there was an area still fused with the structures of the Wandenreich. A section of its walls were destroyed and white smoke began to rise. Then, a number of figures, even whiter than the smoke, emerged from the inner side of the wall. The Shinpei, alarmed for the greater palace, simultaneously draw their swords and adopt a fighting stance. However, the monk reined them in with his voice. No need to concern yourselves. These are not opponents you can defeat. At that point, one of the white figures that had already leapt in their direction, clicks his tongue as if dumbfounded. TCH, what's that? You ain't gonna fight? Grimjow Jagerjackez, the white figure, reminiscent of a wild beast, glared at the monk and Kyoraku with a sharp look in his eyes as he landed. But, did you punks really think that by sheathing your swords, I would retreat just like that? Although Grimjow still had his hand placed on his Zanpakuto, a small ball of hollow bullet struck the back of his head. Gah! When Grimjow turned around in response to the shock of something striking his head, there stood the female Arankar who turned up in the Soul Society at the same time as him. Neliel Tuodelschwenk, her left hand, which appears to have just shot the bala, was pointed towards him. Neliel, why you picking fights at a time like this? Now that the Quincy King has met his demise, it is we who are the largest foreign body in Soul Society, you know. So what, if you're scared, then you might as well take that burden and escape through a garganta at once. The one Grimjow had called a burden was another female Arankar who was being propped up on Neliel's left shoulder. Tyr Harabel, the Espada, who held the same Trace, title is Neliel. When the Wandenreich attacked Hueco Mundo, Haribel bore the full brunt of the battle at the front lines. However, she was incapacitated by Yuacha's overwhelming power and ended up being taken captive as testimony to Hueco Mundo's oppression as it stood. Later, when the Soul King Palace was being remodeled, Yuacha incorporated his own castle prison. As a result, she who had become his prisoner was also brought along to this airspace in accordance with that. Whether it was a warning to the Arrancars, or even meant to refashion her into the Quincy Vanguard, now that Yuacha's deceased, the purpose of her continued captivity has become unclear. Nevertheless, the one thing that is for certain, is that she is still alive, and at present, free thanks to the efforts of Neliel and others who had arrived along with Kurosaki Ichigo's group. Although Neliel had actually rescued Haribel, the new ruler of Hueco Mundo, she harbored mixed feelings at the current state of affairs. Whilst feeling a sense of bewilderment at the fact that they who were once his subordinates, were standing in this place ahead of Aizen who desired so much to reach the Soul King Palace, Neliel addresses Grimmjow who was aiming his hostility at the Shinigami. Picking fights with opponents who are exhausted by war with the Quincy's. Is that your idea of a satisfying fight? TCH. What an overly optimistic thought. Do you really think these Shinigami assholes would just let us go anyhow? I don't wanna get slashed up from behind the moment we turn to leave. The one who responded to that, was the good-natured old mad with the jet black beard and a bald head. Heavens, seeing as it's you lot, we'll turn a blind eye to you all you like. Or if you wish, it would be no trouble escorting you up to Hueco Mundo. Huh, and just who the heck are you? You've made a grave mistake underestimating us. They, in their injured state, did not even pose a threat. Interpreting the remark in that way, Grimmjow glares at the bald-headed old man after his whole body had filled with a thirst for blood. However, the opponent in question replied in an unfazed manner whilst easily brushing aside that thirst for blood. On the contrary, the opposite is true. After all, the lot of you are a far greater source of calamity than the hollow than can be found here and there, regardless of whether you are purified or exterminated. If one was to heedlessly do so under the current circumstances, then the equilibrium of the three realms of existence would be sure to collapse. Quote ellipsis ellipsis quote. Grimmjow was silent for a brief moment, but perhaps reaching an understanding in his own mind, he brings his bloodlust under control as he gave a click of his tongue. When it came to him, it's likely he wanted to waste no time in settling things with Kurosaki Ichigo rather than idle about in a place like this. Guessing as much, Neliel considered that when push comes to shove, she would silence him by launching a surprise attack and then drag him back to Hueco Mundo. Suddenly, Haribel, who was being lent her shoulder, opened her mouth to speak. Is that what you call the Soul King? Whisper-like words which could even be taken as a soliloquy. Her gaze was directed towards the thing behind the Shinigami, being enshrined at the center of the palace. Such a thing is the foundation of Soul Society. Miss Arrancar, are you not able to tolerate something like this either way? In response to the words of the bald-headed man who stroked his beard while questioning her, Haribel slowly shakes her head. Right now, I am merely a defeated soldier. I am not entitled to say anything. But, the man who was once our leader, I understand why he would continue to detest that thing. Separating herself from Neliel's shoulder, Haribel turns on her own feet so her back is to the Shinigami. Sorry for having inconvenienced you. Someday, we will repay this debt. Oh, never mind about all that. For us, it's enough if you can keep things quiet in Hueco Mundo. Moreover, if you want to express your gratitude, you ought to say it to Kurosaki Ichigo-kun, not us. Kyoraku said this whilst showing the Arrancars out, and thus they left the greater palace area as is. Ah, that's right, I have to repay a debt to that Kurosaki bastard, the male Arrancar could be heard muttering, though he was speaking of a different kind of debt, to the one Haribel had mentioned earlier. Upon hearing that, the female Arrancar with the ram's horns rebuked him in the same fashion as before, saying, is it really your wish to settle things with Ichigo when he's riddled with wounds? Oh my, Ichigo-kun has a wide circle of acquaintances, doesn't he? Huh. To the side of Kyoraku, who had mumbled this, the monk was also heading outside the greater palace. Where are you going, High Priest? No need to worry, I'm merely going to take a moment to wake up the Zero Division. The Zero Division, consisting of 5 members including the High Priest, they are the elite guardians belonging to the Royal Guard, said to be comparable to the entire force of the Gote 13. Each member is a pioneer who has created such things as the Zanpakuto or the Shihakusho, which can even be described as the very foundations of the modern-day Shinigami. Perhaps it could be said that these are the great men and women who built up the history of the Shinigami, from zero. However, while making his way here, Kyoraku had heard that the Zero Division, excluding the monk, had died by the hand of Yuach and his subordinates. Kyoraku felt a sense of puzzlement at the choice of words, that is, wake up, but the answer soon came spilling out from the monk's mouth. It's not the case that our own flesh and blood was converted into the Okain just for show, you know. The spiritual pulse that surrounds the Zeroben Raiden which all of us were given, is almost fused with the individual Raryoku of each Squad Zero member. As long as the Zeroben Raiden are not completely destroyed, they can be revived to the point of being up and about again, if I call their names. TN. Zeroben Raiden are the separate palaces, estates of the Zero Division members. In that case, it would have been truly inconvenient if Ichigo-kun was not victorious, don't you agree, High Priest? At one point, the Soul King Palace was reworked to Warwelt by Yuach. If Yuach was alive and well, the last vestiges of the Soul King Palace would have disappeared before long, and with the exception of the monk, Squad Zero may have ended up quite literally annihilated. No matter, the Zero Division do not die so easily, I won't let them die. Such is their fate. Well, at any rate, I must have Etsu and the others work harder from now on. Speaking in an easygoing manner that was not dissimilar to Kyoraku on normal days, the monk then paused for a brief moment. He stroked his beard several times whilst raising his eyes to the sky of the Soul King Palace. Because there also seems to be a certain child who has taken advantage of this war, to cause a little mischief. About 1 hour later, Soul King Palace, Huden, oh. Man, I'm up the creek, yo. Namaya Etsu had only just managed to return from the boundary of life and death thanks to the efforts of the monk. In a deeper underground level of the Huden, he was melodramatically tearing his hair out within a storehouse for swords which would usually exist at the bottom of the sea that extends around his Zero Raiden. What is projected into his eyes through a pair of glasses, is a demolished iron door, and the remains of cloth and Shimenawa rope which had been cut up into pieces. Under normal circumstances, there would have been a certain Zanpakuto seal there. However, the seal had been pitilessly destroyed and the Zanpakuto in question had disappeared without a trace. After observing the state of affairs, a young girl who was standing to the side of Etsu, Hyuchigashima Mera, a Zanpakuto spirit who is also one of Namaya's bodyguards, released a heavy sigh. So this is what happened while Master was beaten down after getting carried away with the excitement. Geez. This storehouse for swords is usually kept deep in the sea and is thus a difficult place to reach, but since it dried up when forging Kurosaki Ichigo's Zanpakuto, the floor of the sea was now widely exposed. We're in the middle of an emergency situation, and still these messy conditions just had to be piled on top, huh? Saying that, Etsu corrected the position of his glasses as he eyed the surroundings. Several men were collapsed about the place. They were currently undergoing revival by all members of Etsu's guard headed by Tanakawa Toki and Nomi no Nanami. The ones who fell, are those who were in charge of safeguarding the sword vault. After all, the sea became an open door after it dried up, and both I and Sayafushi were out too, you know. Etsu then narrows his eyes. The kind of emotion in his eyes is different to the time he had a confrontation with Yuach and the others. They were enshrouded in a subdued anger. And most importantly, I'd never have guessed that some lowlife would take advantage of the emergency situation in Soul Society to pull off a heist. Among the Zanpakuto that had taken on a humanoid form, there were strange aspects to their injuries despite the fact that each one of them is relatively skilled. There were those who received burns, those who had parts of their bodies frozen, those who continued to convulse as if they had been electrocuted, those who appear to have been exposed to poison, those who had holes pierced all over their bodies, and even those who seemed to have had their limbs crushed with a blunt instrument. Watching the guards who were covered in a number of unique sword wounds that can only be caused by Zanpakuto, Mera clicks her tongue. Damn, just how many people did it take to pull off a stunt like this? If they have such military force, then they should have sent them our way to assist in the war. Then, one of Zanpakuto who had regained his consciousness, shook his head at Mera's words. It's not like that. Hey, are you okay? It's not like that, you say. What do you mean? They were alone. When they attacked this place, it was just one person. Mera inclines her head further at the words of the other. Assuming that his words were the truth, the various types of scars were incomprehensible. However, Etsu exhibited a different reaction. Narrowing his eyes behind his tinted glasses in a smiling expression, Etsu spread both arms apart and gave a firm nod as if to say he was completely satisfied. I see, well. I got it, so that's the way it is, huh? This gives me the creeps in more senses than one. Don't go keeping your insight to yourself, master. So demanding Mera-chan. Well, Through our talk just now, I've more or less dug up the crook here. After a brief moment of contemplation, Etsu picked up a piece of the seal cloth that lay strewn about the floor as he calls to mind a certain character. Now, whilst gazing at the cloth which looked as if it had been bitten off by something, he mutters to himself. No sword should be handled by small fry, but, ikomikidomo, squared ain't a sword that can be handled by small fry in the first place. Whispering the name of the zanpakuto that had gone missing, Etsu glares at the empty space with eyes clouded by a slight sadness and anger as a swordsmith, and also heavy doubt. If that's the case, I wonder who you have in mind to wield it, yo. Noble of the four great houses. And so, with the conclusion of the war, the containment barrier of the Soul King Palace was closed off once again. The influence of the Soul King that remains as unchanged as before, and the frozen atmosphere would make one feel the vestiges of war. Moreover, some live coals of a disaster. Or is it, the various sins, which have lived on since the dawn of Soul Society, drifting aimlessly within its pronounced reishi?